Karen mentioned that you've been writing a lot. I think, Sarah, you've written, what, over 300 books under various names, and I haven't even figured them all out. So let's very quickly tell us a little bit about your writing path in basically a tweet. I do not want a novella.
Okay. So I started my career at Sesame Street. So I have a whole lot of Sesame Street books, and that's the pseudonym part of my career. I spent 9 years there. And then when I moved from New York City to Connecticut, I became a freelancer. And when my kids were slightly older and I was able to spend a lot more time at the library, I started in earnest to be a nonfiction writer. So I have, should I show a few of my books, or are you going to?
I think that's a great idea.
Okay, so this book came out last year. It's called Accidental Archaeologists, True Stories of Unexpected Discoveries. This one, I'm not doing these in order, but whatever. This one came out 10 years ago. It's called Poop Happened, A History of the World from the Bottom Up. And it's the history of toilets and sanitation, a perennial favorite with the 8 to 12-year-old crowd. Bugged, How Insects Changed History. This one is Dog Days of History. It's the history of our relationship with dogs and how we became best friends through the ages. This one is very fun to show on Zoom. It's the history of North America. It's 15,000 years of history in a pulled out timeline, 8 feet long, both sides. I could go on Jeopardy. I know everything about North America. This one is a beautiful National Geographic designed book. It's called
And How We Met.
Yeah, that's right. I think National Geographic introduced us. So this is called Why They Wear That. It's not so much the history of fashion as history through fashion, what people wore and who made the clothing and picked the cotton and dyed the wool and all that sort of thing. And this one, which Susanna likes to talk about a lot, is Poison. It's called Poison, Deadly Deeds, Perilous Professions, and Murderous Medicines. So it's the history of how people might have poisoned one another or been poisoned, sort of part whodunit, part chemistry. It was really fun to write. So how is that?
Love all of this. And I also love, because I feel like the introduction in Poison in some ways, as well as some of the other things that you've written about, led to fairy tale science. So let's talk a little bit about fairy tale science. Where did the premise from fairy tale science come from? And you've often talked a little bit about how this started in childhood. So could you share a few of your childhood questionings?
All right. So childhood for sure. I mean, I remember being terrified by the movie Snow White when I think I saw it when I was 4, because I was the youngest child, and the youngest kid always gets to see things way, way, way before they're supposed to with their older siblings. But I just remember being terrified by the wicked stepmother. But I really wanted to know, when Snow White takes a bite of the apple and falls down and seems like she's dead, but she's not dead, and they can't find a pulse or what, or breathing, and like what kind of poison would do that? And I asked and asked and asked. And then as I got old, and no one answered. And then as I got older, I read a lot of literature, and, you know, there's tons of poison in Shakespeare. But not just poison. I think that really what sparked this idea was all the way back in college. I was very, very fortunate to take a course with Stephen Jay Gould, who, if some of you may have heard of him, if you haven't, he is sadly no longer with us, but he was a paleontologist and evolutionary biologist. And his class was just super accessible and fun. And he sprinkled his lectures liberally with like B-movie references and baseball and stuff like that. And I remember one lecture, he was talking about surface to volume and how creatures can't possibly be just stretched out and bigger than, like, you know, he would show like these B movies of like ants and the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, and which is just this ridiculous, you know, this woman-shaped woman, but she's 50 feet tall. And he's like, this could never happen, and here's why. And it stuck with me. And so of course I worked that into my Jack and the Beanstalk chapter. But I don't know, I guess I've always sort of read fiction with a nonfiction mind. I just have always wanted to know, you know, when I read something in fiction, I just want to know, is that possible in real life? And what happens at the molecular level and all that sort of thing. So
So there's so much to ask and so much to talk about with this book, which is one of the reasons I believe it's such a perfect book to ignite, delight, and cultivate both literary history and science. And the way you approach this book, which, by the way, is published today by Odd Dot, an imprint of Macmillan Publishing Group. Talk a little bit about the fairy tales that you were less familiar with, because clearly as we look at some of these fairy tales and we see references in your previous work, we can see that you knew something about some fairy tales, but my gut is that you weren't as equally familiar with all of the fairy tales. For what were some that you were less familiar with?
Honestly, I did know, I would say there are 25 tales. I knew, I think 24 of them really well. The one I didn't know is called Vikram and the Vampire, but it has different names in Hindi language. But I really, it was such a tough dance to do with. I wanted to use fairy tales that are familiar to American children, and many of the Disney movies, of course, have made kids familiar with Snow White and Cinderella and all that. But I didn't want it to be 100%, Amero-European Grimm's and Perrault tales. But the more I got into it, the more I realized that Grimm and Perrault took tales that were international tales. I mean, many of these tales are old as the hills, like Little Red Riding Hood and Rumpelstiltskin and Cinderella. There's zillions of versions of them. So that made me feel a little better about not being too Eurocentric. And I have something called Tale Origins in each chapter that says, okay, yeah, so the Grimm's brothers wrote this story down, but it probably originated in XYZ. But Vikram, I did not know. And I have a good friend, Nandini Bajpai, and I asked her to recommend an Indian tale it's such a cool story. And it was perfect because I could ask the scientific question, do vampires and zombies exist? Answer, yes, in the animal world.
I love that on so many different levels. And I think it is so great because each of the tales has a little bit of history and sometimes a little bit of question. I will have to admit that I also think my students and I really appreciate the quirky nature of the text that you write and retelling the fairy tales. So talk about what it was like to take some fairy tales who are so incredibly well known, but to present them in your own voice.
It wasn't hard at all because I've had a lifetime to formulate an opinion about many of them. I mean, I remember just being horrified by The Princess and the Pea and her manners, and the prince, for that matter. For those of you who don't remember this, it's a Hans Christian Andersen tale, and this prince goes and lives with his mom and dad, and he's really morose because he really wants to marry a princess, but what if she's not a real princess or worthy of him? So he's kind of a jerk. And then this princess shows up in a storm, and she's all bedraggled, and she claims to be a princess, but they don't know if she is a princess. And so they put a pea, the queen puts a pea under her mattress and stacks it up, and then she complains the next morning about what a terrible night's sleep she had. Like, what kind of a house guest is that? So I just remember being really annoyed by a lot of these tales. I've forgotten your question. Oh, Goldilocks. I mean, she breaks and enters. She's like the worst person ever. And then she's shocked to find the three bears standing there in their own home. So all my synopses, I hope, invite a bit of critical thinking on the part of the child. So they're not, I sort of talk about the tropes in the introduction, like the damsel in distress, and then the hunky Prince Charming who comes and saves the day. And like older women are all like either dead or witches or evil stepmothers. That's all these kind of tropes that you sort of start to take for granted. But I want kids to kind of question these roles. And I talk a little bit about the history as to why older women might have been seen as witches. Many of them were healers, and they used things that appeared to be magic, or if somebody's cow dropped dead, they blame the healer. So I'm rambling.
I think that's so great, because one of the things I don't think people will automatically think of when they see this book is how it's such an ideal opportunity to deal with stereotypes. And you've alluded a little bit to how as a childhood you saw things that really drove you crazy. But do you think as a child you recognize some of the blatant stereotypes as much as you do now? That question comes from one of my students.
No, I'm sure I didn't, but I I knew bad manners when I saw them, and I had a very strong sense of justice. I mean, again, being a youngest child, I think the youngest out in the audience will understand this. You just get this sense of like, this is what should be happening, and it's not fair that it isn't. So I think I don't think I saw too much of the damsel in distress kind of stuff. And like, I wanted to be a princess when I grew up. I loved pretty dresses and all that stuff. But luckily I had parents who were pretty good about showing me the way.